So 4 years ago, I talked about my own racial identity formation as a white person. And as I was thinking about that, reflecting on it as I prepared for today, and actually even as I was writing it, what I was going to say 4 years ago, two things occurred to me. One is that this is not a very interesting story. My life, for the most part, was very sheltered, very white. And as I wrote that process, I thought, wow, this is kind of boring. But the second thing I realized is that my life has become much more interesting over the past several years due to relationships, deeper relationships with people of color, and to my own awareness of what it means to be white and to be on that journey. So I'm not going to tell my own story today. I'm going to talk about a model of racial identity formation, and I hope that some of the information that I share with you will help you have deeper relationships and understand your journey better and make your story more interesting. So I thought it would be useful to begin by talking a little bit about what counseling is. So counseling is often thought of as a profession in which a counselor engages with a client and helps them deal with difficult life circumstances such as depression, anxiety, grief, and a lot of other disorders, and it is that. However, what we know in counseling is that we begin with purposeful conversations because we're dealing with an individual, and individuals experience life differently. And underneath those issues often is a question about identity. Who am I as an individual? And what we know is that that's what needs to be addressed before we can really deal with anything else. An important area of identity, particularly in this country, is the identity of race. What we know is that life in a racialized society complicates the process of forming a healthy racial identity. Even as believers with a new identity in Christ, we are daily impacted by how those around us view us and reflect that image back to us, often through the use of stereotypes. In other words, our identity can be shattered by looking at ourselves in the mirror of a racialized society. Each spring, I have the privilege of teaching a course in multicultural issues and counseling. And a lot of times students come in and they think what the course is going to be about is learning how to work with others who are different than themselves. And what they find out when we go through the syllabus is a lot of it's going to be learning about yourself. One of the key assignments in that class is called a cultural autobiography. And in that paper, students are asked to look at how they came to view race. How did they come to understand their own race? How did they come to understand the race of other people? And I've been very enriched by reading those papers and experiencing other people's journeys. And what I've discovered is that in that class, for people of color, I think what's helpful is it begins to normalize the process, that some of their significant experiences and thoughts and feelings are given a language that they progress through. For whites, it's interesting because for most of them, this has actually been the first time in their life that they've considered that they have a race, that they're on a journey, that it is developmental, and to think about what that really means. And as Brother Stephen said, I don't know if he's here today, at an earlier Mosaic gathering, we do need to talk about what it means to be white. There are a lot of very good models of racial identity formation out there specific to racial groups that really help put the process in the context of experiences in this society. But when I give an overview talk on racial identity formation, I typically use the models developed by Daryl Wing Sue and David Sue. This is one of the Dr. Sues. And the reason I do that is they have developed two models one for whites and one for people of color, but they use the same language for the stages. And so talking about both at the same time, it's easier to use this one model, and what that allows us to do is to see that regardless of race, we go through the same stages in the process of racial identity formation, but we probably go through them at different paces and for different reasons based on our race. As with any developmental model, it's often helpful just to begin at the beginning. So when we look at babies or we see pictures of babies, we often have feelings of warmth and affection. We see them as innocent and trusting and full of potential. And we probably see them a lot like our God sees them, as his perfect creation, ready to start out on the life that he has planned for them. As Dr. Cha said last week, God does not make mistakes. Sue and Sue take it from there in their first stage of identity formation, and they talk about an age at which we're very naive about differences. Those of you who spend time around young children probably know that while children notice differences, they rarely ascribe value to them. We start off our life as observers rather than critics of God's gift of diversity. Children are not born with a value system around racial categories. That is a learned behavior. Unfortunately, in this society, we learn it rather quickly. The natural curiosity with which we enter the world is rather quickly replaced by fear, distrust, stereotypes, judgments, and injury. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum is an African-American psychologist, educator, researcher, and writer. She is the author of a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And in this book, she describes very poignantly the process of racial identity formation in a racialized society. When she's describing the pervasive, damaging, and often unnoticed effects of racism, she compares it to polluted air. We breathe it in and day out, and it begins to be part of our normal. It is damaging us long before we learn to be concerned about it. In a racialized society, the lifestyles, value systems, and physical characteristics of the group that hold the power are most valued and rewarded. The message is constantly reinforced through educational materials and perpetuated by the mass media. In other words, we learn early that race matters profoundly. White children begin to internalize the message that society is okay and I am okay. Children of color receive the message that society is okay, but people who look like me are not. In her writings on white privilege, Peggy McIntosh describes the benefits afforded to whites as an invisible, weightless knapsack of assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. She talks about how the educational system contributes to a stage of conformity and notes that, for whites, these advantages often go unrecognized and unchallenged in the absence of effort and introspection. In other words, it is possible for a white person to remain in the conformity stage for a lifetime. At some point in our lives, most of us realize that race does matter. People of color are subjected to overt racism and microaggressive behavior every day. Our 24-hour-a-day access to news and social media make it very difficult to ignore this fact. Over the past years, story after story after story has come to light about injustices perpetrated against people of color by institutions in this society. Dissonance, then, is the awareness of two messages. Society is okay, society is not okay, that do not mesh well with one another. Both cannot simultaneously be true. The question for individuals then is this: can I still be okay if I play by the rules of this society? If the answer to this question is no, an individual might move into a stage of resistance against the norms imposed by society. People of color often feel a strong sense of identity and commitment to their racial group and a feeling of distrust and dislike for whites and what they represent. Last week, Marva talked about a return to music and a peer group that felt culturally relevant and affirming, and a desire to avoid interaction with whites. The white person who progresses to this stage will begin to realize what racism is all about. There's likely to be considerable anger at family, friends, and society for selling a bill of goods, fueled by feelings of guilt and shame. And the white person in this stage has very few places to go. They are uncomfortable in former relationships and still relatively inept at forming relationships with people of color. The message of this stage is society is definitely not okay. I am angry, and I will withdraw from it. It's difficult to remain angry and isolated indefinitely. The level of intensity of feelings is draining. A move forward leads to a time of introspection. For people of color, friendships outside of the group may be desired. A longing for reconciliation may emerge. For whites, this is a time of a reformulation of what it means to be white and what it would look like to have different types of relationships. The message becomes society is not okay, but I need to learn how to be okay in spite of that fact. People of color who again move forward learn how to affirm what they value most about their culture, reject the negative messages of a racialized society, and support others in the process. Whites at this stage learn to appreciate diversity and experience new feelings of connectedness with members of many groups. There is a shift from trying to help or change people of color to changing the self and other whites. The message: society is still not okay, but it does not need to define me or determine my relationships. The last stage of the Sue and Sue model is a white-only stage. This is not in the model for people of color. People of color have this commitment throughout their journey. Whites must choose this course of action daily. For a white person to choose this path, there must be an ongoing support system, the creation of a new community. So it'll be a lonely place much of the time and will require ongoing recommitment. There are great rewards in this stage, but also great temptation to return back to a more comfortable place of fitting in. Ministries like Mosaic are crucial in this stage. People of color cannot combat racism alone. Whites can't do it alone either. In spite of our history of division, conflict, and distrust, we need each other. The message: society is not okay. I want to help change that. Borrowing again from Dr. Cha last week, what Satan has intended for evil, God can use for good. That is a very quick run through the model, and I have questions for you that I'd be very interested in hearing your reaction to. One thing to consider, the questions do have to do with a model of identity formation. As you start your talk, you're probably not going to remember the names of the stages, and that's not important. I think what's important is talking about how can understanding this as a process that I am engaged in help me tell my story, and what does it look like when I engage with other people who are at different places than me?